Exactly, Tricky Ricky. They try to soften the blow of being enslaved by your government by allowing you to beg the government for relief. So they deem you a felon and you have to beg for relief from your disability that they put on you. Because the whole point in being sentenced to Department of Corrections is to correct your behavior. But this is where the people fail. This is where we, the people, have failed and allowed the government to turn our Second Amendment right into a privilege. The prison system has an 85% return rate. So that means 85% of the people who do prison time and get out end up going back at some point in time. And that supports the civic virtue theory that these people shouldn't be allowed to own guns because look at how many of them reoffend again. That means once a criminal, always a criminal. And based on the laws, we can lock them up for only but for so long, and then we have to let them back out again. So let's let them back out again with leashes on them so they can't go crazy and go wild, even though we know they're going to end up right back in here again. So those criminals that get out and reoffend, they actually help to build support for this, firearms ban for felons. That's why there's so many people that seem okay with this, even though it's a blatant violation of the Second Amendment. As a matter of fact, every law in the United States pertaining to firearms regulations or prohibitions is completely unconstitutional because nowhere in the Second Amendment does it say only under certain specific conditions can citizens own firearms. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. In every single gun law on the books that exists from the state to the federal level is an infringement. And it's so ridiculous that once you get charged with a gun charge and you go to court for that gun charge, you should be able to beat that gun charge with one simple statement. And that simple statement is, well, I'm being put through this entire process because this court seems to be adhering to the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution. Yet I'm being put through this court for violating a law that clearly violates the Second Amendment of the Constitution. So you're going to apply the Sixth Amendment while simultaneously violating the Second Amendment. That is a legal contradiction. You can't do that. You're either going to comply with the Constitution 100% or not comply with the Constitution 100%. We're not going to pick and choose and cherry pick here. So if you're going to put me through due process and do all of this, you can't do it for a law that violates the Second Amendment. And the law clearly violates the Second Amendment because nowhere in the Second Amendment does it say that these laws are just, legal, and not prohibited. It actually says the opposite. It says that those laws are prohibited. That's why it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And a government infringement on that right would be a law that limits that right, a law that restricts that right, a law that essentially turns that right into a privilege. But you see, most people would have read this passage with the word privilege and read right past it and not even seen the significance in this word even being included in this passage. It's not a privilege, it's a right. Just like being put through the court system and having a trial. It's not a privilege, it's a right. So even if everybody in that court system thinks that you're guilty, guess what? They still can't deprive you of your right to a fair trial. So they give you a fair trial because it's a right, not a privilege. Shout out to William with another 5-piece on the Cash App. Appreciate that, William. Y'all hit the Cash App, man. William needs some support. William needs some help over here. William's doing all the work, and we can't have that. We cannot have that. So should felons be able to own guns? Yes, because if they're going to be able to if they're going to be able to speak freely, if they're going to be able to have their day in court, if they're going to be able to have their right to privacy, they should have their right to keep and bear arms, because felons are living, breathing human beings too. And if the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was written to protect human rights, then all humans should have that right. And I'm sorry to say it, but we'd be better off in a world where everybody got to own a gun and the right to own guns was not infringed upon, because the people who shouldn't have guns but have guns will be dealt with. They will be dealt with by the people. We wouldn't have to wait for the courts. And that's how you'll get a reduction in crime. There's gonna be a massive wave of defensive shootings, and then all of a sudden crime's gonna drop off, because all those criminals are gonna get tired of watching their friends get shot. They're gonna realize that they're operating in a society where the people are armed and they fight back. They're going to realize that they don't have helpless victims that they could just go pick and choose from now. And it'll be basically a self-instituted purge. Shout out to Big Dog with the 5-piece on the Cash App. Says, peace. Appreciate you, Big Dog. But let's check out this article right here, and then we'll get into the rest of it. So the argument is, historically, the government was able to ban firearm ownership from certain groups of people based on whatever criteria they came up with. And now they can ban convicted felons from owning firearms, as this is the criteria they've come up with to deprive American citizens of their rights. But again, the big question is, are these actual American citizens? Are these considered the people? Because if so, they should be afforded their Second Amendment right and all their constitutional rights as every other member of the people or every other citizen of the United States of America. So the short answer is, should felons have guns? Should felons have a right to have guns? Yes. Yes. As should everyone else. Yes. Because then, to make the distinction between violent felons and non-violent felons would still be making the distinction between, is this person a citizen or is this person a slave? So now they can divvy up the felons and say, well, this group of felons are citizens because they're non-violent, and this group of felons are slaves because they are violent. So why are both groups considered felons then, if there's this distinction between them? That means all non-violent crimes shouldn't be considered felonies then, because non-violent felonies should be considered misdemeanors, and those non-violent criminals should retain their Second Amendment rights, if that's the way they're going to look at it. And that's just my opinion as to how it should be applied, if this is the application. Either that, or if they want to continue banning felons from owning firearms, then they need to make it clear that these so-called felons are not citizens. But you see, that's why they put the label felons on them in the first place, because that label legally distinguishes them from the law-abiding citizens, from the citizenry. So it puts them in a separate subclass who have limited rights for the rest of their lives. And it shouldn't be lifelong. Now, some people are going to say, well, if you allow guys to get out of jail and get armed, then you'll have blood on your hands for every person they shoot with their Second Amendment pistol. Perhaps, but what if they get out, they get their firearm, and they become law-abiding citizens, and they themselves end up shooting a violent criminal that was trying to rob them. Is that criminal's blood then on my hands? Or did I just do that person a great justice by affording them their Second Amendment right, which essentially saved their lives? You know, the defensive uses of firearms far outnumber the offensive uses of firearms, meaning the violent crimes committed with guns are far outweighed by defensive acts with guns. Did you know that? Because amongst the reported ones, right, Alice McGee, over on Rumble, Alice McGee says some rights are inalienable, but some are a privilege. And that's the problem. That's the problem. They're either all they all have to be privileges because they're all contained in the same document. So they either all have to be privileges or they all have to be rights. And if we're going to call them rights, we need to apply them as such. I forgot what I was saying when I looked at Alice's comments, and I got to back up a little bit. Right, Alice McGee, over on Rumble. Because it was committed with guns are far outweighed by defensive. Oh, yes. Defensive uses of firearms far outweigh crimes committed with firearms. And that's because of the documented defensive uses of firearms, you know, where the criminal was shot or a gun was drawn and police were called, it was documented. Those outnumber and outweigh the amount of violent crimes reported and documented that were used that involve firearms. And I say the defensive uses far outweigh the violent crimes because the majority of defensive uses of firearms do not get reported. Because if somebody tries to break into my house, unless they physically damage my property and I'm able to pull a gun and get them to run away, guess what? I'm not calling the cops and dealing with that bullshit. I just made it clear to those criminals that this ain't the house to break into. And guess what's not going to happen? They're not going to try to break into my house because they know I got a gun. Right, Mike Hill over on YouTube. He says, nobody buys a legal gun to do illegal shit. Exactly. Exactly. And Tricky Ricky made a good point. He said, some criminals can change their ways and become law-abiding. Not all, but some. And that's the tricky part. Yeah, that's the tricky part. But the thing is, of the 85% of convicted felons that reoffend, what the question is, what percentage of those guys are guys that get caught with guns, peacefully exercising their Second Amendment, but get thrown in jail because of this prohibition of their rights, this conversion of their Second Amendment right to a privilege? Because New York State is notorious for that, for locking guys up just for having a gun in their car. They didn't rob anybody with it. They didn't shoot anybody with it, but now they're considered a reoffender because they got locked up for being in possession of a gun. So it's almost like the felon in possession statute creates reoffenders. Let's say there's a guy that robs some folks, and one of those folks happens to be a drug dealer or something, and he robs him for his jewelry and his money and shit. Gets caught by the police and goes to jail. Gets out of jail. Now he's got a drug dealer that he robbed looking for him. Shouldn't he have a right to protect himself, even though he's quote unquote considered a violent criminal? Because now he's got a reason to fear for his life, even though it was an action that he caused. He's got a reason to fear for his life. because he went to jail. He did his time for his crimes. So his debt to society should have been made even. But now if he gets caught with that gun that he got to protect himself, guess what? He's now a reoffender. He's now a felon in possession. And these are all the little nuances that we have to take into consideration when we're having this discussion, should felons own firearms? Because the majority of the consensus behind people who don't want, or the majority of the consensus among people who don't want felons to have firearms, is all based in fear. It's all based in the fear that, oh, allowing felons the Second Amendment right means they're all going to arm themselves and form this big criminal army and go march on cities and towns and shit. When that's not the case. Most of these guys just want to have a right to protect themselves. And they should be afforded the right to protect themselves. So that federal ban on felons possessing firearms. Now, I can understand the federal ban on illegal aliens possessing firearms because they are literally not citizens, not legal residents of this country, so they shouldn't get the Second Amendment protections because they're not citizens, but they're not slaves either, but they're rather foreigners. They're foreigners. They're outsiders. They're not Americans. They're not the American people. So that makes sense. Because you don't want a bunch of foreigners coming in here in droves and arming up, because that's the makings of an invasion. Kind of like what we're seeing now. Just like felons, foreigners don't have a right to vote or hold public office. I mean, now they're getting a chance to hold public office because of the liberals. So felons are being treated like foreigners, basically. But it's worse because they're not foreigners. They don't have a home country that they can run back to. This is their home country, and their home country chooses to deprive them of their constitutional rights. You either deprive me of one or deprive me of all. But the correct thing to do in terms of universal application of law, they should be deprived of all if you're going to deprive any. Or they should be deprived of none, because while they're incarcerated, while they're locked up in custody, they don't have a right to privacy. They don't have a right to free speech. They don't have a Second Amendment right. In most cases, they don't even have a right to a fair trial, because if somebody attacks you in prison, you're going to the hole just like them. No trial, no nothing, just punishment. But you're in state custody. You're state property. You're a slave of the state. You're in involuntary servitude to the state. But once that time is passed and that time of slavery to the state is complete and you're released back into society, you should retain the freedoms that everybody else in society has. That, to me, is a correct application of law. But you see, once they started injecting fear and feelings into the conversation, then they were able to make the case for depriving citizens of their Second Amendment right and treating them like slaves, even though they've completed their time of servitude to the state. And it's become so obvious that this deprivation of rights is unconstitutional that some states have even created pathways for felons to get their civil rights and their gun rights back. Now, I think that's a step in the right direction. It's a small step, and it damn sure ain't a step far enough. But at least in taking that step, they acknowledge that these people are citizens. They just got to check in and go through this process to retain to restore the rights that they were deprived of during their time of servitude to the state, incarceration. Like in the state of Florida, the legislature voted to have felons allow felons to have the right to vote in Florida. So they got their voting rights back. And the Florida Department of Law Enforcement actually has a process now that costs about $75 to get your gun rights back. But because of the federal ban, getting your gun rights back doesn't apply in other states. So you're still subject to those federal laws. And if those states are prohibitive of felons possessing firearms, guess what? Florida might allow you to, but other states won't. So you're still a slave. I think the best remedy, the best short-term, the best long-term remedy would be correcting the issues with the prison system and actually making it a Department of Corrections rather than calling it one. Like teaching these guys skills and trades and giving them something to look forward to when they get out of jail, not just locking them in a cage and then throwing them back out on the street. But the short-term solution would be to remove the federal felon in possession ban and leave it up to the states. And then we'll start to see which states actually value their citizens as citizens and which states are basically slave states. So it's a very interesting conversation to have, and there's a lot of nuances there. But on the other side, banning felons from keeping fire from owning, banning felons from let me say it correctly. Depriving convicted felons of their Second Amendment right is unconstitutional, and it shouldn't be. If we're going strictly on a legal, on paper basis, that statute should not exist. But once you start having that debate, and the fear and the feelings get injected into the debate, then you start to get the justifications for enslaving American citizens who've committed crimes and done their time. And I don't think that's fair. This is why so many and the problems with the prison system and the corruption in the prison system is the reason why so many guys go to jail for minor crimes and become bigger criminals while they're in jail. The Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, yet prisons still institute cruel and unusual punishment. Deprivation of food, deprivation of proper resources, deprivation of a healthy living environment, mixing violent criminals with non-violent criminals, locking up minors, children, young people in prisons with adult predators. You know, all these issues. It's to the point where calling the prison system Department of Corrections has become a euphemism. because it's not, because nothing gets corrected. But anyway, that's my take on should felons own guns. Yes. Felons should have a right, should have a Second Amendment right, just like everyone else. Yes. Because the Constitution says so.